Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whenever you should happen to find this. Welcome to the 22nd episode of the Quote of Arms podcast, where we talk about our favorite tribes, what makes them special, and what makes them unique to us. I'm here today with...
Hi guys, my name's Christian. I'm a marine biologist and I've been playing Merfolk for a really long time.
So you observe the fishes and then you build decks around them, eh?
Exactly.
Awesome. So the tribe we're here to talk about is...
Merfolk.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was kind of said already, but I'm a little bit of a, OCD, and I have to go by the same script and such.
Yeah.
So let's start from the top down. So you said you're a marine biologist. We talk about merfolk. Merfolk are also referred to as fish in the game.
Yeah, pretty much. There are some creatures that actually do have fish as their creature type, like sharks and stuff like that. But generally, if you're referring to a tribe as fish, you're talking about merfolk.
Okay. So yeah, that's kind of the magic vernacular there. So why do you think merfolk are called fish?
Well, merfolk are generally represented by aquatic humanoid creatures that are heavily inspired by fish. So, they breathe underwater, their mechanics are very tied to blue mana, and they're really identified as the fish race in popular culture and magic.
Absolutely. So, there are different kinds of merfolk if we're going at the aesthetic angle. If we're looking at the art, how are merfolk, like, in the traditional, or like the traditional sense of merfolk different from, say, Mara, which are technically also merfolk?
So, in popular culture, merfolk are almost always described as having the torsos of humans or human-like creatures with the tails of large fish. So, you're thinking about the mermaids from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, or from The Little Mermaid, stuff like that. But merfolk
what jumps to my mind is
magic.
What jumps to my mind is from Futurama when they talk about how, I wish it was the other way around because it doesn't quite work.
Oh, that was a Family Guy episode. That was the one when Lois killed Stewie.
Well, that was where they actually created that, where it was the fish on top, human on bottom. But on Futurama, that they had the city of Atlanta sink.
And, that's right.
And Fry tried to engage in carnal relations with a merfolk just to find out it didn't work the way he wanted.
Yeah. And, you've got the merfolk in magic are more often seen like how Aquaman would be a merfolk, or the character from The Shape of Water, how they have legs, they're still aquatic, and they have gills and stuff like that, but they can still go on land.
Might depend a little bit on the plane, because I'm looking at Tatiova, I think she has almost an eel-like tail.
Yeah, and Lord of Atlantis is another one that commonly doesn't look like the other merfolk, except in judge promos. In most cases, he looks like a classic merfolk with the giant tail.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at others like Master of Waves, or pretty much any of the Ixalan merfolk, they look very different because they are much more humanoid, and they walk on two legs and travel on land as well, just near bodies of water.
Interesting. And then we get to the Marrow.
Yeah, so Marrow are kind of... So those are from Lorwyn and Shadowmoor. And they often are more monster-looking merfolk. They have the sharp teeth and sharp claws and look more like deep-sea fish than regular fish. When you look at, Marrow Regery, especially the the DCI promo, and he's got the long tail, but he looks like he belongs from a much darker part of the ocean.
Absolutely. So, yeah, and I think it changes a little bit also, not just based on location, but based on color pairing.
Yeah, that is also true. And so, Merfolk is pretty heavily in blue and green, but there are Merfolk represented in all 5 colors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's basically blue and then splash everything else. It's kind of how it works.
It's pretty heavily in green at this point. It used to be mostly blue and then splashing other colors. On Shadowmoor and Lorwyn, it was split where Lorwyn had blue and white, and then Shadowmoor, which was the same plane, but like one was nice and pleasant and one was evil. They turned into blue and black, and each time they're represented in Magic's history, they tend to have very different focuses based on that color pair.
Mm-hmm. So how do those focuses kind of change?
So, for one thing, blue and red especially just is not the color that Merfolk tend to exist in. There's only 5 in Magic's history, and 2 of them are legendaries that do non-Merfolk things. So one of them is Dalakos, who from Theros Beyond Death, who interacts with artifacts and just is a blue-red creature, and it just happens to be a Merfolk. And Jory and Ruin Diver, which has to do with casting second spells per turn, and that's kind of just a general theme that blue and red does, and it's another creature that supports that. But blue and white focused a bit more on the Merfolk synergy. So a lot of the white cards will create a Merfolk token when they become tapped, or when you cast a spell and create 2 Merfolk tokens. Or Sig River Guide is a popular commander that the Professor often plays, which is target Merfolk gains protection from the color of your choice. So it is heavily leaning towards Merfolk synergy and tribal synergy. But then when you go to Shadowmoor with blue and black, there isn't really any synergy among the Merfolk. There's some synergy with rogues, with being unblockable and supporting rogue synergies or unblockable synergies, like Zerasan the Trickster, which gets bonuses for having rogues that deal damage, or Stig River Cutthroat. But you don't really see any blue and black Merfolk that care about other Merfolk specifically for tribal synergies. So when we're talking in Commander, the question you're usually debating is, do you want to go mono blue, blue and green, blue and white, or Bant?
And if you're going Bant, I think you have to go with a non-Merfolk commander, I think.
Yeah, so if you're going Bant, the only Merfolk commander that you have access to is Tuvasa, which, similar to blue and black, weirdly enough, it doesn't care about Merfolk at all. It only cares about enchantments. And so with blue and white, you have to choose Noyandar if you want to use a Merfolk, or Sig if you want to use a Merfolk. So there are very limited choices for commanders, and most of your choices for Bant especially are going to be things like Chulane, which just gives you access to the white Merfolk, but as a commander is just general good stuff and isn't actually supporting Merfolk. Or you might go with a partner pair like Thrasios and Ravos or Timna, which are the 2 common partner pairs on EDHREC, but you could do something differently as well. But once you start leaving blue and green, you are much more going to be looking at non-Merfolk commanders.
Absolutely. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't some enchantments that could be really helpful. Like, one of the things that merfolk like to do is be a little bit sneaky and get in there for little bits of chip damage, or even for a lot of damage. What are some of the ways that merfolk sort of get around some of those bigger creatures?
So that mostly relies in their blue color, so it doesn't really tie into the whole damage or getting into that damage. That's mostly within blue. You can get some payoffs if you add black into it, but a lot of the blue spells that are great for that are going to be merfolk that turn lands into islands. So you can make sure that a lot of the merfolk that have island walk are able to deal damage, or there are some lords. So lords being a tribal creature that supports other creatures of that tribe by giving them bonuses.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, Master of the Pearl Trident is a 2/2 for 2 blue. That is a merfolk that gives other merfolk +1/+1 and island block. And so, once you have this creature out on the field, if any players control islands, you're able to deal damage directly to them.
Yeah, what I was sort of leading towards is that there are cards that have been played in previous versions, like Spreading Seas or Seas Claim, that could potentially trigger some of those could potentially bridge a little bit of that merfolk to enchantment gap.
Oh, for Tuvasa, you are correct. But also Tuvasa does focus on a Voltron strategy as well by making her really big. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be very different from a merfolk. If you want to support Tuvasa, it's going to be very different from a typical merfolk deck. And if you want to use a typical merfolk deck, Tuvasa is going to be a very minimal part of it and only just occasional support if you are drawing the enchantments.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some other just general good stuff like Smothering Tithe that you could throw into a deck like that. So it's a viable commander, and there are ways to sort of bridge that gap. It's still not necessarily what you usually consider to be merfolk, and you probably wind up having to play some cards that are somewhat subpar just to get the themes to work together.
Exactly. The other big consideration to make is, does having to use those subpar cards in order to support a banned commander or a Azorius merfolk deck? There are only really 3 or 4 white merfolk cards that support the merfolk tribe. Does using those subpar cards warrant or count? Does the negative counter the pluses that you get from the access to those white cards? I built Kumena because I felt that having a sorcery that creates 2 blue merfolk tokens and a 1/2 white merfolk that when it becomes tapped creates another merfolk token. I just didn't think it was worth making a commander that couldn't profit like Kumena did with merfolk synergies.
So, who is Kumena? Or at least what is the card?
So Kumena came out from Rivals of Ixalan, and was the second set in the Ixalan block. And Kumena is, for 1 colorless, green and blue, is a 2/4 Merfolk Shaman, and it is the most popular Merfolk commander according to EDHREC, which is 2,096 decks out of the total 3,000 or so.
So one aspect.
And so Kumena's abilities are that you're able to tap Merfolk in order to gain card advantage or power advantage by tapping 3 Merfolk. You draw a card. By tapping 5 Merfolk, you can put a +1/+1 counter on each Merfolk you control. And by tapping only 1, you can make Kumena unblockable, but usually the second 2 abilities are going to be much more of the focus of the deck.
So, or the first 2, I believe. But so one of the things that jumps out to me is that unlike other merfolk, so one of the things that's true about quite a lot of Merfolk is that they have low mana values and uh, moderate stats. So they may be somewhat aggressively costed, but there aren't going to be like a lot of big ones. They have to become
Yeah,
big
the
together.
ones that are big are absurd amounts of mana, like Tishtana, Voice of Thunder, that's 7 mana.
I have made a
Or
deck around it though.
what?
I have made a deck around her though.
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. And I run it in my Kumena deck. I'm just saying the ones that are big are very high costed. So I'm agreeing with you that most of the Merfolk are cheap
Yep.
with low power and able to get that tiny amount of damage regularly.
I would also note though that they have relatively moderate to modest toughness, which is one of the areas that Kumena is different. With 4 toughness, that means that a lot of the red board wipes that do damage are unable to take her out. To take Kumena out.
Yeah, so Kumena does avoid a lot of things like Bolt and is very survivable. There are also so many Merfolk that support counter magic and stuff like that, so you can really reliably, with this strategy, protect your commander. Which is also true for Sig, but not really for the other Merfolk options that you have.
Awesome. So Kumena is particularly good with a relatively wide board.
Exactly. So the other thing is when you're building Kumena, you want to also support the strategy of untapping your spells, or not spells, your creatures, so that you can use those abilities multiple times per turn or on opponent's turns. So some of the really key cards to be running that aren't Merfolk are Mercfiend Liege, which is a 2 colorless blue-green, 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 so 5 total, 3 of which is hybrid, that untaps all green and blue creatures that you control on everyone's untap step. It also buffs your creatures, but being able to, on every opponent's turn, say, hey, I'm going to draw 1 card, or I'm going to draw 3 cards, by tapping 3 to 9 Merfolk, however many you have, is insane card advantage if you can keep doing that on everybody's turn. And you can still hold them up as blockers.
Mm-hmm. It's also important that you're able to maintain a consistent board state. So you probably need some cards in there that are able to protect your board.
Yeah, so I was mentioning earlier that there are a lot of counterspells that I run in this deck. There's also one kind of pseudo Kumena card that is probably one of the best win conditions in this deck, which is Lull Mage Mentor. And Lull Mage Mentor is a 1 blue 2/2 Merfolk Wizard that you can tap 7 Merfolk you control, so like another 2 Merfolk from Kumena's biggest ability, to counter target spell. And he also puts a Merfolk every time you successfully counter a spell or ability. So with him out on the battlefield, and if you have a lot of Merfolk, you can reliably counter a lot of the board wipes that you're getting. And so there are a lot of effects like that that you can use in order to protect your board state as well.
Oh, do you have Intruder Alarm in there?
Yeah, so I was going to get to that later, but that's another one of the great win conditions and combo pieces.
I was going to say that creates a lock.
Yeah, so I've been able to, on many occasions, in response to anyone creating a creature with Intruder Alarm, you can tap all your Merfolk in order to draw cards or put +1/+1 counters with Kumena, and then they all untap when that creature enters the battlefield. But with Lull Mage Mentor, since it creates a Merfolk every time you successfully counter a spell, you have infinite counter spells, because whenever a Merfolk enters the battlefield, it's going to untap all of your Merfolk to be able to counter a spell again.
So other than whatever's already out on the board, you essentially hardlock the table.
Exactly. The only way that people can get past that is by responding to the counter with another removal spell while you don't have 7 Merfolk out. Because creating the Merfolk is on the stack until you finish countering the spell.
Mm-hmm.
So it does leave some opportunity for opponents to work together, and someone can cast Doomblade on Kumena, I counter it, and someone in response casts Rapid Hybridization, or not on Kumena, on Low Mage Mentor, and in response, Rapid Hybridization the Low Mage Mentor, or Krosan Grips the Intruder Alarm, or something like that.
If it's Krosan Grip, then you can't respond to it.
Oh, yeah, you can't respond to that anyways.
Yeah.
But Naturalize or whatever you choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just it's interesting how some of those interactions work and how you're able to use them both offensively and defensively. Because that to me is the hallmark of being a blue tribe, is that you're able to oscillate between offense and defense.
Exactly, and so with Kumena as your commander, you're able to get that card advantage by having untapped blockers that you can then tap to draw cards, but also you can tap 5 at the end of your opponent's turn in order to make your board huge with +1/+1 counters and swing out. So Kumena is like the perfect example of what you just described.
And it's interesting because Low Mage wasn't entirely what I was thinking of when I was talking about being able to protect your board. I was thinking more of like when you're in green and you have an army deck, you have Rapid Vigor, you have Heroic Intervention, which are, I mean, they could very well still be in there.
Yeah. I also run things like Steely Resolve that give all your Merfolk Shroud, because usually when people are trying to deal with a problem in Merfolk, it's one creature that's creating the big problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because all your other Merfolk are just maybe some lords or that are buffing your creatures a little bit, or it's one special Merfolk that's drawing you an extra card per turn. But when it's something like Low Mage Mentor or Kumena in general, it's one target, and being able to give all your creatures Shroud or Ward or something like that is really important.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, they kind of created Ward.
Yeah, Kopala, Warden of Waves, was the first one that effectively gives all Merfolk Ward 2, but was spelled out before Ward existed.
Mm-hmm. So, we've gotten a lot into green and blue. So, they have little guys, they have lords, and they have ways to sort of get around bigger creatures.
Yeah.
What happens if you're against, say, a life gain deck?
One of my favorite cards for this is Simic Ascendancy. So Simic Ascendancy is a green-blue enchantment for 1 green and 1 blue. Mm-hmm. And whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on a creature you control, put that many growth counters on Simic Ascendancy. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Simic Ascendancy has 20 or more growth counters on it, you win the game. So that is one of the main win cons of Kumena, actually, in my opinion. Because you have this built-in ability to tap only 5 Merfolk to put +1/+1 counters on each Merfolk you control. So if you have 10 Merfolk out and you play Simic Ascendancy, you can win on your next upkeep if people can't deal with the Simic Ascendancy or you.
Like I said, I love alternate win cons like that. And have you actually managed to get that to work?
Yes, I have quite a few times, especially when you have things like Murkfiend Liege or Seedborn Muse, and you can untap all of your Merfolk to do that. I've been able to win with only 3 Merfolk doing that.
Beautiful.
Because I would just, or no, not tap, sorry, or not 3, sorry, 5 Merfolk, because then I could just tap them, untap, tap, untap, tap, untap, because I was able to do that on everybody's turn and still hold up them as blockers, and a couple of them were lords. It didn't take many Merfolk to win on my next turn. Mm-hmm. Because you can also tap the 5 Merfolk in response to the Simic Ascendancy trigger on your upkeep after you've untapped. So you still have that one last window where if you have enough Merfolk, you can still win. Mm-hmm. Other options that you have are, like we were talking about earlier, even if you are against a life gain deck, you can tap 1 Merfolk in order to make Kumena unblockable. And you can still get that chip damage in, like we were talking about giving players Island Walk, and you can win with commander damage. You can tap 5 Merfolk to make him bigger over time, or you can have the Lull Mage Mentor out to kind of infinitely lock out your opponent until you can deal that commander damage. It just really depends on what you're able to draw. But luckily, because of the way that Kumena works, you're usually going through most of your deck over the course of the game.
Yeah, so outside of, say, Lords and some of those upper echelon finishers, how do you sort of fill in some of the early drops?
So that's one thing that I really noticed over the course of my playing this deck is I've found that 2 things are true within Commander with Kumena. One, your power level scales with the number of players you're playing against because of those untapped. So the more players you have, the more you're able to take advantage of those abilities. But also, as the game has progressed and become faster and faster and faster, Merfolk just has had some difficulty keeping up with that because they are not a particularly fast tribe in order to get the ball rolling. Like, you can run a bunch of ramp, but you really need to have a high number of Merfolk out in order to win and develop that board presence that we were talking about. So filling in those early drops are really important, but in my opinion, most of my early drops that aren't Lords or like the Harbingers that search for a specific Merfolk, most of that is filled with ramp in order to try and get to a board state that I can actually start getting a value engine out as early as possible. Luckily, though, I'm just going to pull up my Kumena list to look at my mana curve quickly.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe that most of my Merfolk that aren't absolute haymakers, and there's only like 5 of them, are going to be in the 2 to 4 CMC range. So you don't get those like early 1 drops very often. Mm-hmm. I have a couple like Kosi's Trickster, which helps deal with opponents that are searching for lands a lot, which is a 1 mana that gets buffed every time someone searches their library. You've got the Benthic Biomancer that you can run, which doesn't really support Merfolk, but is just a 1 mana Merfolk. But over a quarter of my deck is 2 mana, and another 20 cards are 3 mana. So you do have a really good early board presence, and by constantly drawing cards, you're able to take advantage when you do have large amounts of mana.
Awesome. So, yeah. So, do you wind up having to use some changelings in there to try to shore up the numbers?
I actually don't. I find that, well, for one thing, personally, when I build tribal decks, I try to avoid changelings because
they're a little weenie.
To me, it feels a little bit disingenuous to the theme. Mm-hmm. Not hating on anybody that does that. It's just not like, it's not how I like to build decks, and I do a lot of tribal. So if I were to include changelings, I'd see a lot of similarities between all of my decks. And I find that the deck actually runs really well if you're only using Merfolk. And I mean, I only have 3 non-Merfolk creatures, and they're Seedborn Muse, Mercfiend Liege, and Sea Hunter, which essentially is critical to a Merfolk deck. Sea Hunter is 2 colorless, 2 blue for a 2/2 mercenary. It's a really old card. Mm-hmm. And tap Sea Hunter and pay 3 mana to search your library for a Merfolk and put it into play. Oh. So,
is it a reserve list card? I know that it's gotten a lot of popularity recently.
I'm not sure about that. I know it got a lot of attention from when Ixalan was printed. but we haven't had a really focus on Merfolk since then. We've had some good Merfolk come out, but not like a Merfolk themed set. So I haven't seen it garner that much attention since then, but it is really important to the deck. And I have no others that are non-Merfolk in the deck, and I find that it still works pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
There are some other great synergies with untapping by having access to a lot of big mana. So something like High Tide is a great way to get a lot of mana if you can untap your lands multiple times per turn. Or if you have a Gaia's Cradle, or Growing Rites of Idlamot, or a Nykthos. Nykthos and Marrow Regery is an amazing combination of cards for Merfolk to get nearly infinite mana.
Mm-hmm.
Marrow Regery is a 2-mana or a 3-mana Merfolk that whenever a Merfolk enters the battlefield, you can untap target permanent, and so you can tap you can untap a land to get a lot of mana if it creates a lot of mana.
Actually, an interesting, so another interesting way, if we're going back to the earlier just general concept of maybe a Tuvasa deck, putting a bunch of land enchantments on a land and then untapping it with Regery sounds like a pretty good game.
I agree. And I think that you could definitely build that, but when you're seeing how the format is evolving and people are really tuning their decks to be as efficient as possible, I think the main reason that the tapping and untapping synergy works well with Kumena is because Kumena himself relies on tapping your Merfolk and generating that value. And so this deck really does rely on the commander to be present and suffers a lot to things like Kenra's Transformation or Darksteel Mutation, stuff like that, heavy commander removal.
Somebody happens to be playing a Pithing Needle.
Yeah, so you'd have to find a way to get rid of that, that artifact. But for that reason, I wonder if Tuvasa would, even if you include a lot of the enchantment synergy and stuff like that, the untapping doesn't really come into play as often. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be as reliable of a mechanic to focus on.
Absolutely. So, how does the table usually react when you say that Kumena is your commander?
If I'm with new playgroups, people are usually like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I haven't seen many Merfolk decks," and they're interested to see how it plays. If I'm playing at my card shop or with a few specific friends, they've seen that how the deck works, and they recognize certain pieces, and they just know to try to keep Kumena off the table and to make sure that I have protection in my hand before I play important pieces to the deck strategy, like Intruder Alarm or something like that. So that's kind of par of the course for any commander that you're running that you know people may not react well to if they know how the deck works. But that's why you have to include counter magic and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you still want to disrupt the balance of the amount of Merfolk in there. So that's where finding things like Mage Mentor that are a counter spell on a stick that works with your strategy and happens to be of the tribe. It's really nice. How about like Curse Catcher?
I find that Curse Catcher isn't great because it's only one time, and you have to get rid of the Merfolk in order to use it. I find that I want my Merfolk to stick around as long as possible, so I would rather run things, and I was actually just about to mention these. You don't only have to rely on Kumena for card advantage, because there are so many other great ways in blue and green that Merfolk can gain card advantage in this deck, with things like reflections of Littjara, that whenever you make a Merfolk, you get to make another, and you can use their abilities multiple times now.
Ooh.
Or things like Kindred Discovery and Guardian Project, that whenever you whenever you play a Merfolk or a Merfolk enters the battlefield, you can draw a card. Or Teferi's Ageless Insight, that whenever you draw a card, draw 2 instead. Being able to go through your deck as much as possible and having ways to make sure that you have no maximum hand size is really essential to make sure that you're getting the protection that you need and able to get the cards that function together well. It's also a reason that I don't feel this deck needs tutors, other than something like Sea Hunter, because being able to search through so many cards, as well as having access to some Merfolk that already bring out other Merfolk and draw cards, you don't really need Worldly Tutor, Mystical Tutor, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's cool to see how the different fish in the sea sort of work together.
Exactly. They really rely on each other.
Mm-hmm. Which is kind of how the ocean works, right?
Oh, yeah.
Granted, some of it's predation, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's like Qui-Gon Jinn said, there's always a bigger fish. But, yeah, this is really a pet deck of mine. I'm currently working on foiling it out.
Awesome.
And it's really cool to see where the artists draw their inspiration from and how they combine popular culture motifs with actual fish and biology and stuff like that. So the deck really does not succeed well unless you have a variety of Merfolk and lots of them on the table.
So what are some of your favorite real-life fish that are shown on cards? Your favorite, like, crossovers between real-life fish and cards?
So my favorite, I actually keep one of these in my wallet. It's not a fish, but it is a crab. Horseshoe crab is my favorite animal, and they have a card of it, so I keep a foil one in my wallet because I think it's cool.
Awesome.
And I have a deck a Merfolk deck that relies on it pretty heavily. They've made some really cool sharks, and I think there's one really old card that's just literally a giant shark, which is literally just a great white shark. Or they've made Hammerhead Shark.
And
then they made... I think those are really cool.
Yeah, then they made Shark Typhoon and just kind of jumped the shark.
Yeah. As far as Merfolk go, you can't really see specific species very often, but you can see inspiration from, like, the Ixalan ones are really heavily based on freshwater fish. And the Theros Merfolk that have the super high fins are really heavily inspired by ocean fish, and like deep ocean fish and marlins and sailfish and stuff like that. And that's just really cool to... And I actually wrote an article about this topic for EDHREC on fungi, and where the fungus cards the artists draw inspiration from the real world to try and make the cards look reasonably accurate and believable. And I really like the representation of the ocean that they've done through Merfolk. And yeah, that's why this is my favorite deck.
Awesome. I wonder if they were to ever create, say, a prehistoric themed block. Well, say something sort of like Ixalan, where they have dinosaurs, but let's say they made like armored fish Merfolk.
Yeah, so there are like a lot of prehistoric fish, like Dunkleosteus, which is the really huge one with the nasty jaws that were completely bony and armored. And that would be cool to see really different depictions of Merfolk, or maybe seeing merfolk that look like whales or something like that. It would be really cool for them to explore more varieties of what they could do with that.
Were Selkies considered merfolk, or were they something different?
So Selkies, in our mythology as humans, were part seal, not part fish. And so when you look at Selkies in Magic history, I think there's only two, maybe three. Yeah, there's three. You can see that they like have the lower bodies of seals, except for Cold-Eyed Selkie, because you can only see its eyes and nose.
Mm-hmm.
But those are merfolk in Magic.
Okay, that's what I was trying to make sure. I forgot their creature typing.
Yeah, they're still merfolk.
Okay, so that might be where you might be able to get into some of the whales, because those were based off of seals, I believe, which are mammals. So that's getting at least closer in physiology.
Yeah, or I really like how they also have hominids and stuff like that. Just doing more weird stuff with ocean animals is really cool.
Yeah, what I was thinking of, I was talking about the ancient fish would be like the wreckfish, which actually are still around to an extent.
The what fish?
Wreckfish. So that was what I was thinking of. So wreckfish are...
yes, okay.
Maybe I'm using the wrong vernacular.
Yeah, so there aren't many like armored fish still today. There are a lot that have like... It would be cool if blue and black merfolk could kind of delve more into death touch fish, like venomous fish and stuff like that as well. I think would be really cool as a different approach to that.
That could be interesting. I think it would also be cool if they had, if they made... I know that they have some cards that have piranhas on them, but it'd be kind of cool if they address like schooling, kind of.
Yeah, my friend and I, in college, made our own cards and our own draft set, and schooling was a mechanic that I actually came up with and tried to make work. And it was basically, if I remember correctly, it was kind of like mitotic slime, where you make one creature and when it dies, it becomes less creatures. And so I had tried to make fish cards or something like that, where when you played it, you could either play it as 2 1/1s, or you could play it as a 3/3 that became a 1/1, or 2 1/1s or something like that for more mana.
There was the card that, in terms of there's always a bigger fish, that goes from being a fish to being a...
Reef worm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so reef worm goes into a fish, which then becomes a whale. And the whale token is actually a prehistoric whale, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
And then the whale turns into a kraken once the whale dies.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you have a Tishana deck?
Yes. My Tishana deck it's different from what you might expect. It's not a merfolk deck, really. It is sort of tribal, though. It's a Morrow tribal deck.
Oh, that makes sense, yeah. So that's what I find with most of the other blue-green merfolk commanders, is that they don't really lend themselves to merfolk that often, usually to other strategies. Morrow is a really cool one to work on.
Yeah, Jimmy Wong, I think, tried to make Tishana merfolk work on a game nights.
Yeah, and then I think he rebuilt it as Kumena.
Nice. I don't remember that, but I think it might have. I think it happened on a.
Or maybe Jumbo Commander did a Kumena deck or something like that.
Maybe. I wouldn't put it past him to put that on like a extra turns, maybe.
Yeah. That may have been what I'm thinking of.
Oh, yeah, I'm in my kick right now where I'm designing decks that I call Red Eye decks, because I work really hard and I don't really sleep a lot, and so I'm trying to build decks that I can play on stream that don't require necessarily a ton of thought. So what they do is relatively linear. So that deck, there are 20 cards that are the general synergy or game-winning parts, and 10 of them are Morrows, and 10 of them are things that make creatures unblockable. So
Huh.
the idea of the deck is draw a ton of cards, make a Morrow creature unblockable, and smack somebody with it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It has worked twice, and it's been played 3 times, so not bad.
Nice. Yeah, usually my Kumena deck wins with either Civic Ascendancy locking people out or just massive Merfolk armies. And being able to outvalue people with like the synergy of making a lot of mana through something like Cryptolith Right or whatever access or whatever combo I'm able to put together. But also I love running something like Dream Halls that just lets you vomit your entire hand onto the battlefield, and then you also get to draw cards and just keep playing them. I just find that so much fun, and it feels like it wins very linearly, but the way that you get to that win is always different. And that's what I really like about Merfolk decks.
Awesome. So yeah, I like how they can play different. They can have a few different types of win conditions they can support. Probably my favorite thing about Merfolk is how they work together.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm a natural combo player, which is kind of weird to say because not a lot of people are. But combo is my natural element, and I like how the pieces of a deck work together to make the individual cards better.
Yeah.
Seize Claim, not a great card. Seize Claim enabling all of your Merfolk to get through, yeah, pretty darn good. Now, there's a reason why they haven't made the blue version of Yavimaya or Urborg yet.
Yeah, something tells me that that's a bad idea.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm not sure what it is yet.
I don't know. It might just be the kick in the pants that modern Merfolk needs, though.
Maybe. I don't play Modern. I only play Commander, so I know that that's a lot more of what I think the professor talks about when it comes to Merfolk.
Mm-hmm.
Being competitively viable and stuff like that. I just have no experience with that, and my understanding is that you usually go mono blue rather than with blue green, because, like I said, Kumena's power level varies wildly depending on how many opponents you have, and the more you have, the less attention is on you, the more you can build the board presence, and the more untapped steps you can get from your combo pieces. So it's not going to do well on one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
Mine never does well one-on-one.
Yeah, that would end up being the tricky thing. I was talking about Modern, though. I haven't played Modern in a long time. I don't really even play one-on-one games anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Same with me.
It's mostly been since I started streaming, and I started initially. I was streaming a lot of Arena, but if I didn't get the high viewership, then it just felt like I was alone, and I didn't really want that. So I decided I was going to try to get the consistent, try to see if I can get consistent EDH games, because at least, even if nobody showed up in the stream, I didn't feel like I was alone for an hour, basically.
Yeah.
So
I gotcha. Spell Table made that a lot easier.
Yep, and that's actually why I created the skull symbol, which is the Discord server. It's because I wanted to get those games to fire consistently. I didn't think it was going to be an almost 300 person thing now. I never expected that.
Yeah, that's pretty great. I'm currently moving and haven't been able to set up a Spell Table yet.
Oh yeah.
Can't wait to be able to. I've been going to my local game store occasionally, once or twice a month, but hoping to be able to get some more games in soon. Once I'm all settled in.
Awesome. Well, the skull symbol's there for you. You can always just lurk in there for a little bit or mute it, and then eventually, when you're ready, just look for games if you want. It's just a awesome, supportive community in there, mostly casual players. But where can the people find you?
I actually am not really on social media anymore. You can find a lot of my old EDHREC articles on EDHREC by searching up Christian. I used to do the Playgroup Brews series and the Scrambleverse series, but I just kind of petered off once I started intensely working on my master's degrees. And I used to do all the social media for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, so that's where I used to tell people to come find me. But that torch has since been passed on to someone else. So unfortunately, you will only find me in the occasional podcast with EDHREC affiliates.
Well, thankfully, I am now one of those. It's been an honor to have you on, and look forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you. Yeah, I love talking about tribes, and I'm happy to talk more.
Awesome.